In the 50s, it became really popular with people that had severe epilepsy to go into their heads and actually cut the connections at the very top of the brain between the left and the right hemispheres. Dr. Roger Sperry spent a bunch of time talking to these patients to see what kind of issues that they had psychologically. And he found out that he could actually have conversations with somebody that seemed like an actual person, but it was only the right hemisphere of the person's brain. And then if you went over to the other side and talked to them, then the other hemisphere would actually speak with them. And after a while, the brain would figure out through the lower connections new ways of having interactions with one another. But for this little bit of time, there was this vision into these sort of secret homunculi, or what they're called, you know, these sort of little people in there. And we still don't know what that means, but through a lot of that research that he did, which he won a Nobel Prize for, we got a lot of insight into ideology. And we're going to talk about some of that today. I'm going to try and give you a simple and practical, really powerful way to keep in your mind a really fundamental difference between liberals and conservatives. And at the close, I want to talk to you about why it's important to use that so that we can, you know, as Reach the Right tries to do, so we can just kind of remove ourselves from some of the demonization that's so unhealthy in our society today. I want to start with a little bit of a warning to you, okay? Because research shows that for each ideology, for liberals and for conservatives, that there tends to be these statistical advantages and disadvantages. It's just the way it is, because it's a useful way statistically to divvy up people, and if you're going to do that, you're going to find advantages and disadvantages. So as you hear some of these things in this talk and in other ones, you're going to not feel real cool about the ones that don't make your team look really great. But you have to understand that having an ideology and having a set of beliefs doesn't have anything to do with whether you're a superior being or not, right? It just means that you have certain beliefs. And you can have those and they can be accurate and you can still be, you know, late on your homework, right? It has nothing to do with it. So just keep that in mind, that as we talk about things, advantages and disadvantages, try to just kind of let that flow through you and see how it sits with you. Okay, so long time ago, way before we were human, really, if you can hang with the evolutionary idea, we had a brain that got split into two pieces. It was a really fundamental and really successful adaptation. Now, we don't know all the reasons why, but we know it's extremely fundamental. And there's a lot of really interesting research with our fellow animals. All large animals basically have this split for efficiency purposes. And what you end up having is groups of modules that sort of think together, if you will. That's how the brain works. And they use separate sets of neurological chemicals, similar but different mixes of the chemicals. There's actually significant neurological differences between the two sides. Now, the left hemisphere does a lot of the heavy lifting of the brain, and it's kind of famous for that. In fact, it's been known, a lot of the left hemisphere characteristics have been known for a long time. It's involved in control, involved in action, it's involved in speech, and it's involved in reason. And these are kind of the things you think, oh, well, that's the brain. Well, that is how they thought for years and years and years. In fact, until the 1950s, I mean, I saw some literature in the 60s that called the right hemisphere of the brain a dark continent, and actually said at one point that it was relatively retarded. And these were neuroscientists. But then since then, what they've discovered is that the right hemisphere has a lot to do with visual types of information and manipulating spatial types of thinking, all right? It also has a lot of very sort of subtle, I want to say, emotional elements to it. And one way to think about it is that we'll have sort of a thought and we'll want to communicate that with somebody, and so we'll generate a speech idea, and it'll kind of run through the right hemisphere, if you will, and we'll get sort of nuance kind of attached to it, and then out it'll go, and we'll say something that's nuanced and clear and And then when we're paying attention, we're watching and we're looking for subtle visual keys into what's going on so that our conversations are much more robust and much clearer with one another. And so, in a way, the right hemisphere is kind of a finishing school for the left hemisphere, if that makes sense. And that's why it took so long to kind of figure it out, because it's just sort of a subtle relationship that it often has with the left hemisphere. Now, Dr. V.S. Ramachandran is a neurologist that I follow a lot. And he has a really wonderful metaphor for how the two brains work together. And it's about a general and a scout. And so the general is going into war, reason, speech, action, control. And he's going at it, got a big plan, going to go over the hill and take over the bad guys the next day. The scout comes trotting over the hill and tells the general that he sees that the bad guys have got nuclear weapons. Well, the general he has kind of a very simple thing to decide then. Does he believe the scout? Maybe he does. If he believes the scout, then he backs off. If he doesn't believe the scout, maybe he sends another scout, right? Something like that. But he has the opportunity to question the scout. But if he believes the scout, then he's going to back off because he's got to change his plan. He's got to change this process that he built to go forward, right? That's a real good metaphor for how we use our left and right brains a lot. The right brain is thought of as an anomaly detector. It's interested in trying to be a devil's advocate for the left brain that's obsessed with control and process. Now, here's Ramachandran's second one, which is much more like regular life, all right? Again, same thing, general's going over the hill, chasing down some big process, going to kill the bad guys. Scout comes trotting along and says, I think there's 800 tanks over there. Now, the general planned for 500, all right? Not as straightforward as the nuclear example, right? No. So what does the general do? Does he go forward? First of all, he looks cross-eyed at that scout like, dude, you think there's 800? Right? I mean, I would. And, maybe he's got some experience with the scout, and the scout is a flake, right? Or he's convinced he's a flake. So maybe he ignores the scout. Or what may be more common is he kind of trusts the scout because maybe the scout took pictures, right? Maybe the scout knows his thing and is able to prove it. But the general says, I'm going anyway because I had a plan, dang it. And it's not going to change things just because there's 300 extra tanks. And then he sends his men to death with this effort going forward. So that's a real complicated one, right? Because now it's not really, there's no nuclear, decision, no Boolean 1-0 situation. This is the way life goes, is you're making a tough decision. And what are you making a decision between? Well, you're making a decision between an important process that you had all these plans for, that your left hemisphere just set it all up to do, and then this freaking jackass comes in from the side, right, and says, hey, I think there's 800 tanks out there. And you have to decide, is he enough of a jackass to ignore him? Or is he somebody that you have to listen to, dang it, right? Does that sound familiar at all? It should. There really is a very strong connection between the left and the right hemispheres and our ideology. So we have this one great engine for purpose. And then we have this smaller one that is involved in the way that I described as an anomaly detector. And what's really odd is that from a philosophical standpoint, we tend to ally with one of those viewpoints or the other in our life. Just like when Roger Sperry found these sort of secret personalities within, somehow now, we don't know what's really going on in there. I doubt seriously there's actual conversations the way that I'm describing between the general and the scout. But we do know something's going on. There's something like a conversation that's occurring because it's so important in life. We have all these situations that happen through, and it's covered in our art, it's in our plays, it's in everything that we live. It's in our love life, is that we got things going on and we have an engine going, and then somebody comes in the side and wants a change, and we have to decide whether we're going to make that change or not. and it's difficult and painful. Either way, right? That's the way life is for all of us. But somehow we tend to go with one or the other. And you know what? I'm kind of a scout. I'm really interested in anomalies, right? And I'm not a conservative, okay? I'm not fascinated by process. Not really. I can be pretty good at it, but it's not where I live. The patterns that we have, they are seen in the conservative world as things that we recognize, right? Making sure that the traditional family works. Controlling change, right? Of all kinds. Any kind. Really. Just move. Change? Whoa, wait a minute here. And then if you do go with change, then it's controlled. It's safe, right? Because safety and consistency is what process is about. You know, when I'm in business, when I'm doing business things, I don't want to put out products that are really, really great, except sometimes it kills you. I need it to be consistent. I need it to be safe. I need things to be good in the sense of always there for you. So we don't want, if we're doing these patterns, we don't want extraneous delays to come in. We don't want things coming in from the side that just slow us down, because that in and of itself is crimping our process, right? And that's a lot of times how we look at things. But the other side of it is, and we have to remember this, and now we're not talking about ideology exactly the whole time, because in our real lives we really have to balance these things well in order to stay at a marriage, right? I mean, when do you leave a marriage? It's an open question, isn't it? At least for some of us. And, you know, you have to think about the fact that you've got a process here going, and it's a sacred process, and you have to keep it going. When does the exception come in that makes you think that maybe it's not the right way to go? And how do you do that, right? So I want to take a quote from Rick Santorum, and I want you to listen to this and think about it. Think about it your old way. You don't need to think about it in terms of all this stuff. I would argue that the future of America hangs in the balance because the future of the family hangs in the balance. Isn't that the ultimate homeland security, standing up and defending marriage? Okay, now let's translate that into neurological terms. And when I say neurological, I'm kind of cheating. I'm not really talking about neurology. This is really psychology, okay? What Roger Sperry did was a bunch of psychological experiments on brain damaged people, okay? So, you know, in a way you have to take it with a grain of salt. But it's psychological values that we're trying to tease out of what he's saying. He's defending a process, isn't he? He's defending a really important process. And he's defending a very precise version of it. In other words, a standard traditional marriage. Okay? Now, he's actually being consistent, because in America in the 70s, everybody thought that way, right? We didn't have these alternative marriages that we've thrown on the table now back then. And we didn't have people living together that much either. It was much more rad then. So in that sense, he's not only defending an important process, he's also defending a consistency. And that's the kind of thing that the left hemisphere worships, really, right? So, let's talk about another one. I believe the Earth gets warmer. This is Rick again. I believe that the Earth gets warmer and cooler, and I think history points out that it does that. The idea that man is somehow responsible for climate change is, I think, just patently absurd. If you think about it in neurological terms, he's not attacking climate change. What is he doing? He's defending something. He's defending an economic life. He's defending a viable circumstance that we have control over. And then the scout comes rolling over the hill and goes, oh, CO2 is this magic thing that just like, I know, man, it's just like, that's how he thinks of it. And then he looks around, and the first thing he does is go, no, temperature goes up and down. Nice try, you know. And he can just kind of knock those exceptions out of the way. And that's a lot of what process chasing is about. you've got to knock exceptions out of the way. They have to be important exceptions in order to try and get things done, important, and to impact a process. And if you let these little processes, these little exceptions continually impinge on a process, you're not going to get anything done. It's not always time to have exceptions coming in. And we know people like that a little bit, that let exceptions come in too much, right? And they can't get anything done, or they're changing their mind all the time. And that's what we're talking about here. So V.S. Ramachandran has another set of studies that he's done on paralyzed people. And he found that repressions, rationalizations, and the denials are they're so-called confabulations, which I love this word. It just means making fables. These confabulations come from the left hemisphere, virtually all of them. Okay, they're not right hemisphere origins. They come from the left hemisphere, and they're designed to basically protect people from processes being changed. We're talking about paralyzed people, and he says, can you please move your left arm? And the guy goes, I don't want to. And he's paralyzed. Or he makes up some story about why he can't right then. Well, my arm's asleep because I was just sleeping on it. And, this is an incredibly common thing for the left hemisphere to do, and we have to understand that confabulation is part of our lives as human beings. It's what we do, okay? We distort on purpose to protect our own image of what is going on. It's not this crazy thing that people do about climate change, okay? This is Rick doing what everyone does, except he happens to be doing it about climate change. And we should understand that about ourselves. We're confabulators, all right? We're just really good at it too. And I hope that as your life goes on, you'll begin to see the denials and the repressions that you do as this sort of method to try and protect your processes from being attacked from the other side. Now, I want to go over to the other side. We've been talking about conservatives a lot. Let's talk about liberals. Liberals are involved in important exceptions, okay, like the Scout, right? But let's look at the important exceptions to us. We can look at the poor, right? They're an exception to us. We're trying to make sure that they're okay. We're trying to foster the idea of an alternative family, an alternative vision of what a family might be. Because we see these exceptions that are perfectly good families, and we want them raised up and highlighted as exceptions that are important so that they get included in the notion of a family. Gun control is about protecting the innocent. A lot of the, listening to the voice of the voiceless is something that we do because we're fascinated by trying to make sure that everything is okay, that these important exceptions are brought into the process and the process is changed in a way that's healthy. Okay? Here's a quote from Occupy Wall Street, their official declaration. They have this long official declaration, and I'm just taking a piece of it. And they use the word they, and I'm going to use the word the process just to sell my case here overtly, okay? The process has profited off the torture, confinement, and cruel treatment of countless animals and actively hide these practices. They've held students hostage with tens of thousands of dollars of debt on education, which is itself a human right. Does that sound like somebody that's pretty hot on exceptions getting brought up and highlighted and dealt with? It is. Yeah, I've been listening to Jackson Browne lately, the last week and a half or so, as I was thinking about this stuff, and he's got an album called Lives in the Balance that he wrote in the 1980s, and it was written as a response to some of the things that we were doing in America. We were causing a lot of murder and mayhem in Central America, and doing so secretly. And he has this song, it's the title track, and it's, I've been waiting for something to happen for a week or a month or a year. And I feel that way sometimes as a liberal. I'm frustrated that these exceptions that I'm after getting better just don't get fixed. And it seems like it takes forever, And then he gets to the chorus and he says, there are lives in the balance. There are people under fire. There's blood on the wire, he says, And I feel that. I do. That's the essence to me of liberalism. But is that exception me? Is it even my kids? Not really. I mean, I'm kind of this, I mean, I have a great life. But those exceptions are important to me. And they're real to me, and they're real to you. And that's why, one major reason why you guys are liberals. So, one thing that's really interesting about this whole phenomenon of the left and the right brain is that for us, it's really easy for us to see that this actually goes way beyond politics for us, okay? If you think about NPR, for instance, when you listen to NPR, Terry Gross, she does these interviews, right? And she'll do an interview of a brachiopod expert or something, and you're like, oh, I'm going to listen to that. And then there's a musician that comes on next, and oh, I'm going to listen to that. And then there's, I don't know, there's a gay Latino politician that comes on after that, and you're just like, oh, I got to listen to that. And we just do this. We're fascinated by exceptions. It's not, we're not just trying to save, mankind here. We're actually fascinated in a very general sense by these little things. In a way, we're kind of trivial experts. Not exactly trivial, but we're really interested in things. I was listening to this thing about San Francisco zoning the other day that Michael Krasny was doing on NPR. Why am I listening to that? I have nothing to do with San Francisco or zoning, but I'm just like, oh, this is so vital for some reason, right? Well, it's because I'm a liberal and I'm taking these exceptions in and trying to figure out what to do with it. Maybe it'll be pertinent to Santa Rosa. I don't know. And this guy calls in from Cleveland. It's the way we are. So it's really fundamental to us as beings. And in the same way, the left hemisphere is also really fundamental to conservatives. So why is all that important? I mean, so what, right? In a sense, because we're fighting bad guys here. There are conservatives who are trying to do things that we got to stop, and right? I mean, they're stupid and evil and crazy, right? I mean, we have to do something about it. Well, the real reason why this is important is because we have to understand what's behind the words. We have to understand how fundamental it is and how impersonal it is in a very real sense, and how it really, in a very real sense, has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with this general predilection that we have to be focusing on processes that work, that we know work, or focusing on exceptions that are important so that we can get those processes to really, really work well for us. And now let's get back to Santorum, for example, in terms of the marriage. I mean, I don't know how you felt when you heard it, but I know when I read that, I'm kind of used to it now, so I didn't have a giant emotional reaction. But, it just feels so constrained, his view of what's going on. It feels, and it feels like he's sort of hyperventilating about how important it is that we have this very standard traditional family. And that's the way we typically think. But let's think about exceptions and think about process here for a moment. What's he really doing? He's really, in a very broad way, he's trying to defend families. Okay? And this is a point I tried to allude to earlier. There are ways that we can defend families. There are ways that we should defend families as liberals. Do we think about it enough? I don't think so. There was an article in the New York Times just a few days ago by this lady who had done some research, and she had made a lot of really great points about what it was like out in the real world and watching people have trouble because their fathers were gone, or they had gone through, the children's parents had gone through multiple partners, or there's a bunch of welfare mothers out there that are actually actively trying to have more children because it gets them a raise. And she was bringing these things up in the New York Times. And the comments were really, and then she had these other policy things that she was suggesting, trying to get single women to get more educated and trying to get people to marry later. It was an intelligent article, and I don't want to go too much about it, but the comments were really interesting because there were a lot of comments from people, from liberals who just recognized it as conservative diatribe, you know. It was just obvious. There was something about families and single women and negative, you know. And then there were other people, other liberals, you could tell, that were in the field. There were a lot of them that were really clearly frustrated because they were social workers. They did see it happening. They wished that these families didn't have this problem. They saw it as a huge social need. Well, if you think of it as in terms of processes and exceptions here, this is something that liberals are working really hard on. These liberal social advocates were working really hard on an important process. But somehow the messaging for us doesn't get through, right? We're kind of like, we think that talking about families means talking about expanding the definition. It doesn't. It means strong families. It means strong nations. It means healthy fiscal situation, right? All those things play into this. So if we can be more robust about the notion of a family, we can actually agree with Rick Santorum in a really important way. And we should. Okay? So in the climate change point, just to close, climate change is really about maintaining the process so that business is successful and healthy. We should remember that there are lots of conservative businesses right now that are very quietly spending millions of dollars on climate change. And why are they spending it? Because it's one thing to confabulate about climate change with your buddies at a cocktail party, or even to elect people who don't believe in it on purpose. It's quite another to tell your shareholders, hey, you know what? I know that weather changes are happening, and I know you have a lot of risk, but I just don't believe in those risks. And they're not doing it because they're practical business people. Okay? So, in other words, we are getting there with climate change. Now we need to focus on that process. We need to respect the fact that it really is a business issue. We need to talk more about the money that we'll make when we do climate change changes, the money that we'll save through the risk problems being taken care of. And if liberals did that more, we would focus and get a lot more attention from centrists and from moderate conservatives, and we would be able to make a lot more headway on climate change. Let's try to talk their language. Let's try and talk the language of process when we can, and to think about what it is that they're really trying to do, because they're not necessarily trying to attack, they're trying to defend.
When you're discussing the generalizations, they seem like, they kind of sound a lot like stereotypes.
Yeah, they do.
Is there a difference?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think there is a difference between generalizing and stereotyping. I mean, maybe there is. I don't think of it in terms of a dictionary difference. What we need to understand a lot of times, and I do this, I say, well, conservatives are this and liberals are that. All I'm talking about is a statistical predilection, which just means that conservatives tend to do this and liberals tend to do that. Now, a lot of these things, they're really pretty difficult to argue with. We have some really good data that's been done now on the differences between conservatives and liberals. As I mentioned earlier, there's all kinds of different ways to divvy up human beings. We got women and men that are a lot different than one another, and this is just another one of those kinds of divisions. It can be, Mexican people are this, right? Black people are this. It can sound like that sometimes. Actually, Mexican people are something sometimes, and black people are something sometimes. You just have to be sensitive about what they really are and what they aren't. You don't want to have a lot of pseudoscience creeping in. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is to just be sensitive, but also, highlight important differences so that we know how to work with them better.
Thank you.
Yeah.